Welcome back to the NWR Virtual Healthcare Conference. Next up, we have the CEO of Cyban, Dr. Mary Beth Brinson. Cyban's brain pulse monitor will change the current standard of care by enabling early detection and treatment of brain injury, allowing faster, more relevant treatment decisions that can lead to life-changing patient outcomes and reduced cost of care for hospitals and payers. It is designed to provide non-invasive continuous measures of intracranial pressure and brain oxygen saturation that are accurate relative to the existing invasive gold standard. Just as a reminder before we get into it, if anyone has a question along the way, I encourage you to type it in using the Q&A panel within Zoom. But without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dr. Mary Beth Brinson.
Thank you, Matt. As Matt said, I'm Mary Beth Brinson. Good afternoon, and I'm pleased to be here to discuss the opportunity at Cyban. People are dying who don't need to. Our founder, Dr. Barry Dixon, has spent his entire career treating patients with severe brain injury in the ICU. And despite all the advances in medical care and technology, he was still shocked and confronted by the survival statistics for people who suffer a traumatic brain injury. These people suffer a mortality rate of 50%, and of the 50% that survive, more than 2/3 have long-term and serious disabilities requiring extended hospital stays or lifetime support and rehabilitation. Dr. Dixon will tell you that a primary cause for poor outcomes for brain injury patients is the failure of the current brain monitoring methods to detect brain injury early and to allow effective interventions that prevent injury or death. Until now, clinicians treating unconscious and sedated patients with severe brain injury have had two choices to monitor outcomes: an inadequate hourly physical exam or an invasive, risky, and expensive brain probe. When treating brain injury, the clinician's goal is to prevent the death of brain cells due to lack of oxygen, which is called brain hypoxia. Brain cells die in 2 minutes without oxygen. If brain hypoxia is identified early enough, there are many interventions that clinicians can perform to prevent devastating brain injury. Unfortunately, most clinicians are flying blind. The standard of care for monitoring unconscious and sedated brain-injured patients is an hourly physical exam where a nurse will pinch, poke, and prod a patient to elicit a reflex response, or lifts the unconscious patient's eyelids and shines a light in their eyes looking for an equal response. This examination is subjective. It doesn't measure O2 or intracranial pressure, and it is not continuous, so it's hard to check for differences, and it's labor intensive. Therefore, if brain hypoxia is detected, it most often after the brain damage has occurred. In the very worst cases, a clinician may refer for monitoring using an invasive probe. These brain probes require a surgery to drill a hole in the skull through the dura to locate a specific space in the brain. This requires a neurosurgeon and an operating theater. Therefore, it can take hours from the time when monitoring is actually desired before it actually begins. There's also an increased risk of further brain injury. There's also an increased risk of further infection. It requires expensive tools, probes, and surgery. And because of this, fewer than 15% of brain injured patients receive invasive monitoring, and most brain injury patients never receive any objective brain monitoring. So what would you do? Surgery and insert this probe. So this is actually a scan of an in situ probe. So would you insert this probe and undertake or undertake a physical exam to monitor for brain hypoxia? And what if you could get that information accurately on O2 and ICP non-invasively? We think the choice is quite clear. So Dr. Dixon has been absolutely driven in his belief that there is a clinical gap here. About 3 years ago, we went to the United States and recruited some clinical champions from Cleveland Clinic, Johns Hopkins Medicine, UT Southwestern Medical Center, Duke University, and Stanford Healthcare. It's good to also validate that this is a broader and wider need, and these clinical champions have shaped our product and our offering and our thoughts about how we enter the market for the last 3 years. Additionally, we've undertaken some independent market research using a company called Stratagen, which applies an outcome-driven innovation, jobs to be done methodology, which is quite a powerful methodology, which allows you to shape your business model and to plan out your product roadmap. And through this process of interviewing 231 US clinicians, we believe that Cyban addresses the top underserved needs for 50% of the market. PulseWise provides continuous, non-invasive measures of intracranial pressure and brain oxygen saturation that are accurate relative to the existing global standard. PulseWise enables early detection and treatment of brain hypoxia, allowing faster and more relevant treatment decisions that can lead to life-changing patient outcomes and reduce the cost of care for hospital and payers. The schematic on this page shows you the sensor that is used. Our sensors are geometrically optimized to capture photons reflected from the venule lake of blood in the brain. On the right-hand side, we're looking at the proprietary waveform that is extracted as compared to the skin response. So we're definitely not getting a skin response. We're actually getting a response from deep within the brain. Most importantly about this proprietary waveform is that it is rich in physiological information from which we can derive things like cerebral oxygen saturation, intracranial pressure, or even the balance of arterial and venous pressures and other valuable information about the status of the brain. This is a typical waveform on the left side. Over the extracted waveform, we apply a feature extraction algorithm from which ICP or oxygen is extracted, and this provides early detection information that allows a clinician to make a decision on a patient. On the right-hand side, this is preliminary data and information from a study that we're conducting looking at strokes. What is most interesting about this is that the waveforms that we see in stroke patients are unique and consistent. We are able to classify early on in this study these waveforms into what we're calling a damp waveform that can indicate brain damage, or an out-of-phase waveform, which we believe indicates ischemia. We hope at the end of the study that it points us in the direction that may lead us to the ability to provide diagnostic and prognostic value about strokes in the future. So invasive monitoring does work. Using the probes, you can demonstrate that the patient outcomes improve, and you see a reduction in long-term disability. Hospital costs are also reduced because you see a reduced stay, and that provides a benefit to the hospital. But even with that, the shocking fact is that only 15% of those patients that could be monitored are monitored using this invasive method due to the risks and the high cost involved. So it's important as we think about comparing our technology that we understand what drives adoption. And so it is quite clear as we compare our non-invasive method to invasive methods, we need to consider costs. We also need to consider efficacy, which we have in our studies. We also need to consider how care is applied now and convenience. So our system is more convenient than the current invasive systems, and it comes at a considerable cost savings to the healthcare system. So what is the real value of early detection in managing brain injury patients? So the golden hour is a commonly used term to describe the urgent need for care of trauma patients. The term implies that morbidity and mortality are impacted if care is delayed past that first hour of injury. In this case study, our PulseWise system detects deterioration an hour earlier than a physical examination. The difference in outcome for the patient, the hospital, and the payer are extreme. Under the current standard of care, this patient, if you look at the gray circle, spends 8 days in the ICU, 1 month on the ward, 2 months in rehab, and due to the poor outcome, is in care for the rest of his life. With early detection provided by PulseWise, he would spend 2 days in the ICU, 7 days on the ward, and return to work in 1 week. The difference in healthcare cost alone is staggering at over $300,000 US. As our advisory board continues to tell us, the opportunities for PulseWise are nearly endless. But for today, let's just focus on the US ICU market. And let's just focus on patients who enter the ICU with a known brain injury. So if we just consider the 5 indications at the bottom of the slide, there are 1.7 million brain injured admissions per year to the US ICU. The complication rate post-admission in these 5 indications is between 10% and 80%. In these patients, the current standard of care in brain monitoring is failing, and the results are devastating, often fatal, with mortality rates ranging from 6 to 90%. If PulseWise is substituted for the current standard of care in just this limited subset of patients, it would provide Cyban with $1 billion Australian opportunity in the US IC market alone. We also must have a compelling value proposition for the hospitals. In this example, we calculate payback for the hospitals for an investment into the current technology they use versus if they were to substitute PulseWise as their standard of care. So if we look at invasive ICP, we see that at 20 patients, the hospitals start to receive economies of scale. So it's important to note that for invasive monitoring, there are no economies of scale. Every single patient, whether you see 1 or 1,000, costs the same, which is a $10,000 surgery, plus the cost of the invasive probe. There are no economies of scale. So at 20 patients for an invasive ICP measure, the hospital recovers the cost of the investment for PulseWise, and going forward is only investing in the sensors at $350 per set. The payback is even more shocking for invasive O2 because while the surgery is the same at $10,000, the probe is over $4,000 for a single-use probe. So at 15 patients, the hospital recovers the cost that they would have invested in 15 patients, and going forward is investing just the $350 for the sensor. The payback example for the physical exam is even more shocking. If you think back to the slide where we had the case study of the brain tumor patient at a cost of $310,000 US because he was missed, his deterioration was missed. At 2 patients, the hospital just in cost, direct cost, is $620,000 into patients. If we can change the standard of care for use, for roughly half of that, the hospital could have 20 monitors and 416 sensors at $350. So effectively, if they catch one patient that they would have missed, they've recovered their costs. So payback is really important, and it's quite a clear case for adoption in these cases. So what does this mean for our investors? Our plan is to launch PulseWise into the US ICU market in 2025 with a consumable and CapEx model, with each sensor set selling for $350 on a per patient single-use basis, and each bedside monitor selling for $10,000 US. By year 5, we forecast installing more than 3,000 bedside units, and that will provide a revenue of about $80 million Australian, which gives us the sensors at about a 70% gross margin. It's also important to consider payment pathways. In the United States, we would contract with the hospitals or with the hospital groups, and we would be able to use currently existing codes for the diagnosis. And the sensors that we're using are already covered for payment under the existing diagnosis-related group payments. So we do not have any coding work to do. We do not have to seek a code. The equipment that we're using is already paid for and covered out of existing DRG payments. But this is only the beginning. The application of our technology provides multiple opportunities for growth over time. Our first generation product is applicable far more broadly than monitoring brain injury patients in the ICU. We're currently trialing PulseWise in the operating theater during high-risk cardiovascular surgery and in emergency departments for stroke detection, as I mentioned. Our second generation will target brain monitoring for first responders, neonates, and there is a large opportunity in the military applications. And even after that, we have the opportunity to look at using monitoring in large organs. As with all medical technology, it's important to note that our technology has a strong patent system around it. The sensors are patent protected. The data that's extracted from the sensors is also covered under that patent, so that physiological rich waveform is covered by the patent. We've got signal processing and algorithms that allow us to report things like ICP and O2 using existing principles. And we have one device that can be used with multiple parameters. So I think it's worth noting that we provide bilateral monitoring. So the sensors are meant to be used, so 2, one on either side, to get brain oxygen levels, intracranial pressure levels, and cerebral perfusion. And we cover this under 2 patent families. We are well into executing our United States strategy. So in 2022, we had a FDA pre-submission meeting where we were able to confirm the predicate device and the trial design and the endpoints. We completed that clinical trial and exceeded the endpoints that the FDA required. And in February of this year, we were able to submit our O2 indication. We're expecting feedback and that in April, with approval due in May. And the ICP indication is well under development with a submission target of June this year. So in addition to ensuring that the clinical need was validated at key centers in the United States, we've also assembled a commercial team. The U.S. market is attacking the U.S. market's no small feat, and we're taking advice from veterans, from medical device companies, health systems so that we can ensure we have the economic analysis correct, and professionals who have worked in the healthcare systems in the United States. We also have a talented management team. I was recruited 9 weeks ago. I started 9 weeks ago. And also, in addition to Dr. Dixon, who's also in the management team, we have recruited our first U.S. employee, who is Tiffany Gilbreth, who has over 20 years in clinical and medical affairs, and she will help drive our soft launch adoption program. And as important, we have a board of directors providing governance and guidance with experience in venture capital, government, policy, and regulatory information. We have defined these value milestones for the company. So as I mentioned, we'll be looking at the oxygen indication approval from the FDA sometime in May. We'll execute a soft launch at our US Centers of Excellence. We'll have an ICP indication by September. And then we'll be looking at a liquidity event at the end of the year, early next year, with a full commercial launch in June of 2025 and a break even at about $38 million in June of 2028. So we are at the very beginning of our 5th capital raise. You can see from our past raises that we've had good participation with a nice uplift during each raise. And we have some notable investors, including Breakthrough Victoria, former C-suite executives from Macquarie Bank, that are participating at a nice rate for us. So thank you for your time. If you have any interest in the company or you'd like any more information about the capital raise, please reach out to me. My email and phone numbers on this slide, or to our chair, Andrew Maxwell, whose email and phone number is also on this slide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary Beth. As mentioned earlier, we'll move on to questions. Again, as a reminder, if you do have a question you'd like to submit, please feel free to type it in within Zoom and we'll get to it shortly. First question I've got is, can you provide a little bit more colour just on what leads to adoption for this type of technology?
Sure, it's an interesting question. And I do want to point out the difference between what happens to diagnose issues of brain injury and monitoring. As I described, you have mere minutes, just 2, actually, very little time to make decisions in these cases. And right now, there is nothing that provides a continuous monitoring for these patients. So what the clinicians are looking for is just assurance that it's actually a response from the brain, which we have provided them through the technology, and that it alerts when there is a change, because that is more information than they get. And then from there, they can enter their diagnostic protocols and make decisions about if they wish to do something. So for monitoring, what they're looking for is assurance that it's actually deriving a response from where they think it is, and that it is alerting for positive and negative change in the patient.
Thank you. The next question is, from a peer or competition perspective, is there anything else in development close to this that you're aware of?
There are more sort of portable diagnostics. So if you think about, like, certainly for stroke, the diagnostic is an imaging. So, but that doesn't compete directly. Am I aware? Not really aware. There are some other things out there, but they're not continuous. So, you know, more similar to the kind of interval monitoring, if you will. So something like a Doppler. But so hand on heart, asked cold, I can't think of anything. I think we are fairly unique in the space right now.
Very good. And from a key opinion leader's perspective, what's the company's strategy in that regard, or what's the company doing?
Certainly. I think it's important to note that for the soft launch, our first hire is a medical affairs expert. We will be working with the KOLs. We've got 6 really good ones that are engaged, and we'll be taking the product out conferences, sort of internal studies that they wish to do. And then we'll use their presence and their networks, if you will, to drive this early adoption web that we plan to land in the United States.
Another question that's come through is, I can see a substantial opportunity to deploy the technology in ambulance fleets around the world, which you see. How high is this as a priority for the company?
We haven't targeted in our second generation. It is a high priority for sure. It does require a little bit of product development, and because we are so small, I think it's really important to note that many companies lose the plot by exercising all their opportunities at one time. And so we're quite focused on delivering this early opportunity about brain monitoring on the ward and ICUs. But it is definitely listed as a priority in a little bit for us.
And toward the end there, you talked about capital raising and mentioned a liquidity event. I mean, is there plans to list the company at some point, I assume? Can you provide some color on that?
Yeah. So look, I think we've listed this as a liquidity event at the end of the year, and we're in a capital raise now, sort of a pre-IPO, if you will. And I think a lot depends on how the markets continue, if they continue to open for the end of the year, or if we're looking at early next year. But yes, we are trying to be very transparent about our raise strategy with the current raise and then one following not too shortly. That bigger raise will allow us the funds to go and land for full launch in the United States. And that's the purpose of the liquidity event. And give us some runway so that we can build, continue to build adoption and build sales revenue.
Great. Well, thanks very much for your time today, Mary Beth. And as you mentioned, if anyone's got any interest, feel free to reach out on the email addresses on your screen there. But thanks again for the presentation. Thank
you for your time. I appreciate it.
And in about 5 or 10 minutes, we'll have the next presentation, which will be from PYC Therapeutics. So look forward to seeing everyone again then.